Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastian from the Department of Philosophy, also a Robert Penn Warren Fellow. And it is my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Mohammed Allehbi. Mohammed is a PhD candidate in the Department of History and the George J. Graham Jr. Fellow here at the Robert Penn Warren Center. His research focuses on the legal, social, and political history of the late antique and medieval Islamic Near East and Mediterranean. His talk today is titled Sovereignty and Criminal Justice in an Islamic Metropolis, 700 to 950 CE. Please join me in welcoming Mohammed.
Thank you, Sebastian, for that wonderful introduction. My presentation today will be about the history of Islamic criminal justice through a longue durée between the 8th and 10th centuries. I'll be going through a number of terms, complicated developments, but I hope after this lecture, you'll have some understanding of early Islamic criminal justice. Let's begin. In 918, the Shurta administered, can I get hosting privileges as well? Because I have to show a presentation. Oh, I have it, okay. All right, let's start again. In 918, the Shurta administered criminal through the vast metropolis of Baghdad. They enforced non-Quranic punishments, ad hoc lashings, and mass incarceration, and coerced confessions through torture as a means to maintain public order. These autocratic methods were condemned by members of the populace and jurists who believed that these actions transgressed Sharia, sacred law. The government responded by attempting to align the Shurta's method with the more cohesive structures of jurisprudence. However, an 11th century historian and government secretary, Ibn al-Muskawayhi, narrates that these efforts actually amplified the existing crime wave, with urban militias engaging in thievery with impunity. Ibn Muskawayhi claims that these short-lived and idealistic reforms undermined the fear and awe of the Shurta that was essential to maintaining order in the city. What is striking about this vivid narrative is that it portrays the ever-present tension between the messy realities of law enforcement and the striving notions of justice, ones that I argue are constant and universal in complex urban societies. This legal discrepancy was a byproduct of imperial rulers attempting to maintain their legal sovereignty in a period of rapid urbanization. In this lecture, I argue that a legal revolution occurred in the pre-modern Islamic Middle East between the 8th, more than a century after the birth of Islam, and 10th centuries. Governments gave complete control of criminal law to their Shurta elite corps. Previously, the Shurta were elite tribal military commanders who had some authority in the criminal sphere, but the fact that imperial rulers relied on them to maintain their authority in the growing city of Baghdad transformed them from a military unit to an urban and judicial power as well. The Shurta evolved into a vertical stratified criminal hierarchy made up of criminal magistrates, district commanders, watch commanders, wardens, and policemen who patrolled, searched, interrogated, punished, and tried an assortment of criminals: thieves, urban gang members, pimps, wine distributors, and con men, and other denizens of the criminal underworld. The Shurta, as well as analogous bodies, held total authority over criminal justice over much of the pre-modern Islamic Middle East and Mediterranean between the 10th and 12th centuries. The Shurta also adhered to a political administrative structure known as siyasa, which clashed with the religious and jurisprudential framework of jurists and judges. This institutional, political, religious, and legal metamorphosis profoundly impacted law and society in the pre-modern Islamic world until the 18th century of Ottoman Empire. In this presentation, I will make 3 interventions. First, the complete control of the Shurta, the complete control of criminal justice by the Shurta clearly shows that they were not merely a security force or police force as pre-modern Islamic studies has categorized them, but magistrates with judicial powers as well. Second, the development and nature of the Shurta also reveals that the so-called gulf between the pre-modern and modern when it comes to policing was not as vast as the majority of historical scholarship has presumed. Recent studies have shown that complex criminal and policing systems existed in pre-modern cosmopolitan centers, such as Imperial Rome and Imperial Constantinople, medieval Italian city-states, and early modern Paris and early modern Ottoman Istanbul. The momentous transformation of the Shurta from elite tribal regiments to a stratified hierarchy was a unique phenomenon. The emergence of the Shurta as judge, jury, and executioner, I argue, was due to rapid urbanization and an expansion of imperial hierarchy, imperial sovereignty, paralleled by other societies, but not at this pace. Finally, the Shurta's methods and perspectives, which clashed with the religious jurisprudential ones, shows that there was a secular and sacred divide in pre-modern Islamic societies, one that I refer to as a separation between state and religious jurisprudence. Despite the importance of the Shurta and its legal relevance, a reconstruction of this institution is beset with obstacles, given the fact that the lack of archival materials and the majority of legal literature being jurisprudential in nature. As the modern historian Kevin Reinhardt has contended, many legal historians understand Islamic law through the prism of religious jurisprudential texts. The authors of these texts had little role or influence on the daily application of criminal justice. My research seeks to amend these omissions by offering a broader social methodology while applying a legal pluralistic lens. I utilize a holistic approach, categorizing chronicles, bell letters, administrative documents, Mayor for Princes, and biographical dictionaries in early Islamic Egyptian papyri collectively as Islamic legal literature alongside jurisprudential texts. By doing so, I help redefine these texts as sources of legal history. I also reevaluate Islamic legal frameworks by viewing Islamic law as composed of a fluid and diverse strands revolving around standard legal sources and dynamics of justice. In the first half of the 8th century, Arab Muslim sovereigns ruled an empire stretching from Central Asia to North Africa. Armies drawn along tribal lines manned frontier outposts known as garrison towns throughout the empire. As the garrison towns held a small militarized population and were rooted in tribal social structures, Islamic law was still at a nascent stage. As a modern historian, Wael Halak has contended, Islamic law was composed of 3 sources of law: the Quran, the Sunnah, and discretionary authority. The Quran lists a few major offenses and their respective punishments: amputation for thievery, lashing for fornication, and execution for murder. But the Quran was not primarily a book of law. So rulers and officials had to rely on Sunnah, tradition, and discretionary authority. Sunnah, tradition, was in essence legal continuity, which was subject to change as Islamic society evolved. In this period, the Sunnah was made up of the judgments of past rulers and officials, the words and actions of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, and ancient tribal norms. The fact that political authority and continuity played a major role in tradition would influence criminal justice in subsequent centuries. Finally, discretionary authority was vital with the ever-changing conditions of the empire and the business of running all these territories. The fact that rulers and officials could apply verdicts based on their personal discretion was needed with these complicated matters. As Islamic law was still at a burgeoning stage, legal jurisdiction was still rudimentary. The responsibility of criminal justice was shared between the head of the elite corps, the Sahib al-Shurta, the Qadi, military magistrate, and the governor. The Sahib al-Shurta was a military representative of the ruler and/or governor. He was drawn from the tribal elites. With his army regiments, tribal pedigree, and the authority bestowed on him by the ruler and/or governor, the Sahib al-Shurta hunted down, arrested, punished with ad hoc lashings and extended prison sentencing criminals, dissidents, rebels, and army commanders and officials who fell out of political favor. They could also intervene in intertribal squabbles. According to the head of a chancery, Abdul Hamid ibn Yahya al-Katib, who wrote a Mirror of Princes in 745, unlike the Qadi, the Sahib al-Shurta, judgments and approaches were rooted in the ruler's discretion, and he had no strict requirements to follow the Quran and Sunnah like the Qadi. Thus, the Shurta's inquisitorial approaches, rooted in government orders, was vastly different than the legal authority and methods of the Qadi. Yet, it was the Qadi who was the main official responsible for criminal justice. The Qadi was a military magistrate who acted as the administrative and legal deputy of the ruler and or governor. He adjudicated most cases, but cases had to be brought to him, unlike the Shurta. The Qadi could also enforce judgments and had considerable autonomy to enforce judgments without conforming to the ruler and or governor's orders. But decades later, the occupants of the Qadi would be drawn from non-military backgrounds. They would also lose their prerogative over criminal justice to the Sahib Shurta. How did this dramatic legal development happen? This was a result of a shift in the balance of power between the ruler and the garrison towns and the metric rise of a new independent religious legal class, the ulama. At the turn of the 8th century, as well as the first half of at the turn of the 7th century, as well as the first half of the 8th century, numerous revolts from garrison towns resulted in rulers demobilizing them. The rulers also created professional military contingents who were rooted in the service and loyalty to the ruler rather than tribal pedigree, and they gave them professional salaries. The Shurta were now drawn from these military contingents. Note the changes enacted by these rulers left most of the Arab and non-Arab Muslim population as non-militarized subjects, some of whom made up an emerging independent religious class known as the ulama. At the beginning of this new period, these desperate professional legal experts studied and espoused traditions some of which place more emphasis on the Prophet Muhammad and his companions rather than the ruler's authority, in essence, undermining it. They also came up with new legal frameworks, a number of which attempted to reduce the ad hoc tendencies of the ruler and Shurta's punishments, and they also forbid torture. The rulers in the second half of the 8th century witnessed the culmination of this social movement, which was seen by members of the populace as people who were the definitive religious and legal authorities at the expense of the rulers and government judges. Also, a number of government judges were being drawn more and more from this social legal milieu. One of the government secretaries at the time, Ibn al-Muqaffa, saw the threat that the jurist posed to the ruler's legal authority and wrote a letter to Al-Mansur, the second ruler of a new Muslim dynasty, the Abbasids, and later the founder of Baghdad. He states that Al-Mansur, as the ruler, had authority, as the head of the Muslim community, had the legal authority to form laws in areas not covered by the Quran and Sunnah, particularly those pertaining to criminal justice. Ibn al-Muqaffa believed that the discretion of the ruler was needed because these jurists introduced varying judgments which created dissonance in the verdicts of the government judges who followed them. Ibn al-Muqaffa advocated that al-Mansur should actually create a book of law based on all these diverse rulings from the jurists, which was kind of like a codex of Justinian. But al-Mansur and his successors would take a different route. They would largely leave the jurists and judges to their own devices, but they would give criminal justice to the Shurta. Unlike the judges, the Shurta, the elite corps, judgments and approaches were rooted in the ruler's discretion, the ultimate extension of sovereignty. This is clearly portrayed in the descriptions of Abu Yusuf, the first ever Muslim chief judge and the chief judge of the Abbasid Empire in the late 8th century. Abu Yusuf cascaded the Shurta for beating men 100 or 200 times on a mere accusation, coercing confessions through torture, and even leaving men to rot in prison until they died without a funeral. Despite his high rank, Abu Yusuf held no jurisdiction over the criminal justice. By this point, the judiciary had no jurisdiction over these punitive matters. Thus, it is clear with Abu Yusuf's criticism that the Abbasids had made their choice to the detriment of judges and jurists. So to recap, in the first half of the 8th century, Islamic law was still developing. It was rooted in the Quran, the Sunnah tradition, and discretionary authority. A number of political traditions formed legal continuity, and discretionary authority was vital in the affairs of running the empire and was utilized by the rulers and the shurta. But it was the Qadi who was mainly responsible for criminal law until the second half of the 8th century. And this was because of the emergence of the ulama who challenged the ruler's legal authority, and more judges began to be influenced by the ulama and their jurisprudence. So the rulers turned to the shurta as their extension of sovereignty, as seen by their role as criminal law enforcers in the vast metropolis of Baghdad. In 766, the second Abbasid sovereign, al-Mansur, built his capital, Baghdad. He initially intended the city as a cosmopolitan administrative center rather than the cosmopolitan hub that it would become. Situated along the western bank of the Tigris, it benefited from an abundance of water from the northern and southern ends. The initial circular design of Baghdad, known as the Round City, consisted of one inner and two outer gates. Within the inner wall, there was a courtyard district where al-Mansur built a royal palace, a mosque, administrative bureaus, and two immense structures, one for the guards and one for the shurta. This immense structure, Dar al-Shurta, headquarters of the elite court, was the first of its kind in Islamic history. In it, the elite military commander and his troops were housed. Al-Mansur also built a new district, Sikka al-Shurta, the street of the elite corps. It's fascinating that al-Mansur built such an immense structure for the shurta and not one for the qadi, the judge, or his vizier, which demonstrates the vital role the shurta played in al-Mansur's vision of sovereignty. But the contours of the capital would change in ways that al-Mansur would not, him and his successors would not expect, and with it, the nature of the shurta. So if we zoom out, we see in the following decades and in the early 9th century, Baghdad had rapidly expanded from around Sunday on the western bank of the Tigris to one straddling the two banks of the Tigris on the eastern and western side. And now there were districts, neighborhoods, and markets. And we see how these developments affected the shurta with the establishment of two new elite corps headquarters, and with the replacement of the old elite corps headquarters in the Round City. And this is not surprising, as the city had now attracted populations as far flung from the Iranian plateau to Egypt. With the introduction of papermaking and new trade networks, book and mercantile cultures were flourishing, with the translation of Greek literature and books written by Muslim authors on a range of topics from history to medicine, and goods being brought by caravans from and to China. Within this bustling city, new social hierarchies and urban tensions emerged, vastly different from the tribal societies of old, which in turn put pressures on the government to find new ways to control the city. Amidst all these changes, the shurta would transform from an elite military unit to a criminal magisterial and policing power, which resulted in more divisions of the shurta. In the early 9th century, the two shurta commanders had under their authority a new division of the shurta, district commanders. These district commanders patrolled the 4 districts of the city and under the authority of the two shurta commanders on the eastern and western banks. But these complicated activities needed a single official to coordinate them. So there was a creation of a new office, Sahib al-Shurta of Baghdad. However, his administrative seat was not in either of the two elite corps headquarters, but in his own palace. Until the end of the Abbasid Empire in the mid-10th century, the head of Baghdad Shurta consistently made the main headquarters and the main criminal courts in his own residence. For example, this area of the city was home to the many residents of occupants of the Sahib al-Shurta of Baghdad, derived from the military elite family, the Tahirids, were an Eastern Persian military elite family that governed the province of Khorasan. From this palace, the Sahib al-Shurta would command two of his deputies serving in the two elite corps headquarters on the bridge. These Shurta headquarters functioned as criminal courts where suspects were confined, interrogated, punished, and prosecuted. From there, they would be either taken to one of the many prisons throughout the city, or they would be punished between the bridge between these two elite corps headquarters for all eyes to see. But the growing urban pressures meant that another division of the Shurta had to be created, the commanders of the watch. The commanders of the watch supervised the guards who patrolled the streets, neighborhoods, and markets. Literary narratives speak about local anxieties of after a night of partying and drinking, trying to get back home after the night curfew and trying to avoid the patrols. Because if those patrols actually captured you, the next morning is going to be especially rough. While the Shurta governors became so immersed in the business of waging wars, putting down rebellions, and even running a religious inquisition at one point, matters of criminal justice and policing fell more and more in the hands of the two elite Shurta commanders. The two deputies stationed in the twin headquarters between the bridge became so involved in the control of the metropolis that their military duties began to fall on the wayside as they transitioned into a municipal, criminal, and magisterial policing power. Thus, the essence of the Shurta had largely been altered from an elite military unit to judicial authorities. So, given the clutter and all of this map, it's clear that the Abbasids went a tad overboard in attempting to establish something approaching a police state. But how was this enforcement felt on the street level? How does the system function? How was it arranged? Fortunately, we have an administrative text that gives us all of this information. In a chapter on the Sahib al-Shurta in a 10th century Mirror for Princes, Siyasat al-Muluk, written by an anonymous author, he details this Shurta hierarchy. It is imperative for the watchmen to inspect their own activities and those of the inhabitants in the area and their occupations. They should bring to the attention of the commanders of the watch anything that arouses their suspicions. Then the commanders of the watch should bring the report to district commanders, who should then take it to the deputies on the western and eastern banks. This matter should not be delayed by night or by day. And the district and watch command, the Sahib al-Shurta should order the district and watch commanders and scrutinize the common people and elites by day and by night. The Sahib al-Shurta must search thoroughly for fugitives in both well-built places and ruins and repeatedly watch over certain roads and markets. As the passage demonstrates, the literary portrayal of the Shurta hierarchy aligns with the author's perspective, one admittedly an idealistic perspective in which the Shurta runs like clockwork. Any suspicious activities or people were then conveyed in a vertical hierarchy through the different strata of the Shurta, fugitive, criminals, and suspects, under the penetrating eyes of the government, were details sought after, and exits were sectioned off and roadblocks were erected. Yet patrolling, punishments, and surveillance could only go so far to exert the ruler's authority in the city. Information was needed, which resulted in the government employing innovative methods. Unlike the Arab tribal societies of old, new categories of criminality confronted the rulers and or Shurta. The anonymous author of the Siyasat al-Muluk speaks of new categories of criminals. He lists coin and bag snatchers, chiselers, conmen, grave robbers, wine sellers, and tricksters. This is not to mention the Ayarun, urban militias who engaged in banditry, sectarianism, and financial exaction. they challenged the Shurta's authority in the urban quarters, attempting to dominate them. The government in the late 9th century endeavored to suppress these criminals by reforming them. Did they reform them by attempting for them to, become better people? No, they just recruited them because they wanted them to use the skills that made them such great criminals, the violence, the ability to navigate the city, to rat on other criminals and police the city. Actually, what's interesting in this Siyasa Mulk is there's mention of female informers. And it's frustrating because there's no other information given on this. But it seems that there were female criminals as well as male criminals who acted as informers, telling the Shurta on the latest happenings in the criminal underworld, though they were not above stealing. Old habits die hard, after all. Yet Muslim jurists became wary of the Shurta's methods and practices, with a number of government secretaries providing alternative interpretations of law. In the early 9th century, the literary sources demonstrate that the Shurta had become the primary enforcer of criminal law in cities like Basra and Kufa in the province of Egypt. But the jurists were extremely vexed at these developments, and you can tell that they were not happy about this with their circulation of traditions where the Prophet Muhammad says that the Shurta were dogs of hell. So they weren't exactly fans of the Shurta. In this period, jurists took advantage of the introduction of papermaking and cosmopolitan lifestyle to produce voluminous works on law that were in an ongoing, vibrant discourse. Jurists mainly envisioned judges as the ones who dealt with criminal justice, as they were above all else learned in jurisprudence. Similar to Abu Yusuf, jurists and judges condemned the Shurta for adopting practices such as evidentiary torture. They also weren't happy with them running brothels as well. This objection to the use of torture was a majority view among the jurists, including Abu Yusuf, who clashed with the law enforcement methods. Notably, secretary and law enforcers held different legal perspectives. In fact, secretaries took over the role, acted as counterparts to the jurists in attempting to inform the Shurta on matters of law. The 10th century government secretary, Ibrahim ibn Wahab, known as Ibn Wahab, was a member of an old and distinguished secretarial family, and he also includes a chapter on the Sahib al-Shurta in his administrative manual. He details the Shurta's role outside of Islamic jurisprudential conceptions, and its discussion provides a greater understanding of criminal justice under Abbasid rule. Ibn Wahab writes that according to veterans of the Abbasid bureaucracy, these institutions operated under different frameworks and methods of proof. The judiciary accepted authoritative witnesses and their statements, while the Shurta prosecuted by reasonable doubt. Unlike jurists, Ibn Wahab does not see the difference in these jurisdictions and approaches by an application of sacred law or lack thereof. Rather, he justifies this divide as being naturally defined by the particular methods of proof that each case demanded, which can be seen in how he articulates the difference between the Sahib al-Shurta and the Qadi in the former's extraction of suspects. The Sahib al-Shurta applies presumption to the accused and whoever habitually strays into criminal activity, and he coerces them and draws out statements until he uncovers what is within them. Indeed, it is possible that someone who is innocent would be convicted, as the forceful extraction of facts from thieves and those like them cannot be obtained unless it is in that manner. If the Sahib al-Shurta only asked for proof in such a case from a corroborating testimony by men with reputable standing or the statements from the righteous in the neighborhood, he would never be able to derive facts about a theft. There are many points to dissect in this passage. First, though Ibn Wahab's reasoning is cloaked in secretarial parlance, the sentiment is that torture was the only road available for cases in which it was difficult to find witnesses, such as thievery at night. Second, it is clear that there were certain discourses circulating in the Abbasid administration that saw the administrative and discretionary framework for criminal justice as unique to the Shurta. In fact, the anonymous author of Siyasat al-Mulk, the mayor for princes, states that the Sahib al-Shurta had his own reading material. It is recommended that the Sahib al-Shurta study the manuals of criminal magistrates. In addition, he should study the conduct and accounts of past ruler and events and the astonishing episodes that transpired with them. So I actually, when I saw the fact that there were actually shorta manuals, it really frustrated me, because if they were still extant, it would make the research so much easier. But that's the dilemma of being a historian. So the author's instructions to read for insight into narratives about past rulers with regards to criminal law resembles the earlier Sunnah, which was rooted in political traditions from the earlier periods. Second, a criminal magistrate's examination of shurta administrative manuals is the equivalent to a judge needing to be well-versed in jurisprudence. In fact, the author states that the sources of criminal justice are the Quran, the narratives of rulers, a Sunnah, the administrative consensus of the shurta through these manuals, and discretionary authority. Thus, one needs to think of the shurta and the secretaries who support them as adopting an approach with continuity from an earlier period where political traditions and discretionary authority reigned supreme. So I argue that the shurta and their approaches can be considered an organic offshoot of Islamic law, distinct from the jurisprudential one, which would eventually be referred to as siyasa, government law. Even after the collapse of the Abbasid Empire in the mid-10th century, the system continued to leave an impact on an institutional and normative level, with the appearance of analogous bodies who took over the role of the shurta throughout the pre-modern Islamic world, and the jurisdictional separation continued for the next 2 centuries. Modern scholarship has anachronistically defined the early shurta as police and/or security forces, fully overlooking the significance of its evolution, which was emblematic of an empire developing its sovereignty over both law and urban space. As Muslim rulers expanded their central authority, discarding the tribal oligarchies of the past for a vision of the future that consisted of administrative complexities and cosmopolitanism, this elite corps with its coercive force and military loyalty was alluring as an extension of imperial sovereignty over any other legal institution, such as the judiciary. A burgeoning medieval city predictably brought a proliferation of new crimes and disorders. The rulers unloaded the considerable task of dealing with these crimes and disorders onto the shurta, but the responsibility of maintaining order had the unintended effect of transforming them from an elite military unit to a vertical stratified criminal administration made up of criminal magistrates, watchmen, wardens, and policemen. Because these imperial sovereigns had unchecked control of the punitive sphere, military application of the law grew along with autocratic methods to the opposition of jurists and judges. At the same time, this jurisdictional and normative separation created a secular and sacred divide in pre-modern Islamic societies. As I've shown throughout this lecture, rulers, criminal magistrates, bureaucrats, jurists, and judges grappled with the tension between the ideals and realities of life and death, justice and order, themes that still resonate today. Thank you.